Hey Vertical. On Sunday, we talked about what it takes to break habits, what it takes to be delivered from the bondage of sin, to break the habits of sin in our lives. We use the passage that Jesus taught us to pray. In Matthew, this passage is, "And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And Jesus is teaching us to pray this to God. Now, we spent a little time talking about how the discrepancy, the confusion that this passage can bring up. Can God tempt us? And the answer to that is no, God can't tempt us. We learned that in James. But can God lead us into temptation? Can God lead us to a place of trial and testing where we might fail? Yes. God can do that, and God does that often in our lives so that we can grow. We grow by overcoming trials and tribulations, by overcoming testing. But why then, if God brings us into temptation, brings us to a place of temptation so that we can grow, why would we ever want to pray that God doesn't do that? That God keeps us from temptation so that we don't give in? So there are many examples of this happening throughout Scripture where people will pray for God to do things that would be out of God's character. For instance, you have psalms that are called imprecatory psalms, where people will express their emotions, strong emotions toward God, asking God to do things that God would never do. There's one psalm, a very strong example, where it says, "Blessed is the person who dashes the infants against the rocks." And it's talking about Babylon that came in and killed a bunch of the Israelites and took a bunch into captivity. And the psalmist there says, "Blessed is the one who basically brings revenge upon Babylon." But we know from other scriptures that God would never do that God abhors, that God detests, that God hates people who would ever harm infants. And yet the psalmist prays that, and that's in our scriptures. We have another example of Jesus himself, who right before going to the cross prays to God, "If this cup can pass, let it pass. But basically, because it won't, help me endure this." So Jesus prays that God, if there's any way out of this situation, that God would take him out of this. And Jesus, being God, knew there wasn't. And yet, in this time of extreme emotion, Jesus prayed for that. So what's going on here? What can we take from this? What can we learn from this? I think Jesus is teaching us that it is not just okay, but it is the right kind of prayer to express our emotions, to express our raw emotions to God. I hope you all have that kind of friend who, when you're going through something, let's say someone wrongs you, you're able to go to that person and basically you go through a bashing, a roast of the person who wronged you, and you get that out of your system, and hopefully you move on from there to a place of love. But it is okay to have that kind of person who will be on your side whether you're right or wrong. But we move beyond that. We express our emotions so that we can then move beyond those emotions to something better. And Jesus is teaching us here to express our emotions to God, that God can be that friend that we can speak openly with, that we do not need to constantly wonder if we're saying the right thing or saying the theologically accurate thing, that we can just talk bluntly. We can share our emotions, express what we're feeling to God without fear of God condemning or judging us for that. God already knows what's on our hearts and what's on our minds. So we might as well have that open relationship with him and find out that it actually ends up therapeutic for us. It helps us. It helps us work through those emotions in the presence of someone who can help us work through those emotions. So I encourage you to have an open, honest, and raw friendship with God. That when you talk to God, you're not constantly questioning how you're wording your prayers or what you're saying in your prayers, but instead focus on just being present with God, being there with God, telling him exactly how you're feeling, exactly what you're going through. Because God is a loving Father who is going to not judge you for that, but instead help you walk through your emotions, help you walk through these times of trouble. God's not going to send you to hell for praying something wrong. If the psalmist could get away with praying for God to, or praying for people to dash infants on rocks because of how angry they were, because of how raw their emotions were, and that psalm still ended up in the Bible, then trust me, whatever you can pray to God, whatever you can say to God is not going to be wrong. One time I told my friend he was going through some stuff, and he said, "Man, I just don't know what to do." And the one thing that I felt like God told me to tell him is that bring your complaints, bring your frustrations to God, not at God. Don't throw your prayers at God as if God is some distant being who doesn't care and you're just angry at. Instead, be angry with God. As we talked about reconciliation 2 weeks ago, that's how you begin the reconciliation, is you enter the presence of the person that you have these issues with, and you wrestle through the emotions with them. That's far different than insulting someone from across the room. So don't insult God from across the room. Instead, bring your complaints to God and work through them with him. All right, I'll see y'all on Sunday.